oftentimes people, especially being a rapper, I've been asked so many times, do I think hip hop is a net positive or net negative, or why do rappers talk about some of the things that they do, et cetera? I think a much more interesting question is, why do so many people like it, right? To me, the big question isn't, why do fast food companies sell the crappy food they do? Why do junk food companies sell the junk food they do? Why do rappers talk about sex, money, drugs, their cars, their jewelry, whatever? I'm like, well, because there's a giant market for it. So I think actually the interesting question to me is more on the demand side. Because if there's a demand for it, people are going to supply, right? If tons and tons of people want to, I don't think it's, I know why drug dealers sell drugs, but why do so many people want drugs, right? If there wasn't a giant market for all drugs, then there's no money to be made in selling it. So it's not really like, well, why are people selling? So, well, there's a lot of money in selling that thing. So if there's a lot of money, if there's a giant market, there's going to be consumption for it. And it goes across so many things. It's not, why are so many young women making OnlyFans accounts? And so, like, why are there so many millions of men who are demanding it and paying for it? Like, because there's more of them than there are the people, there's more consumers than there are producers by many multiples. But yeah, I find that a lot of times people don't really ask those questions. It's always like, why is there the supply? Why is there that stuff going out there? And it's like, well, as long as people demand it, somebody, we can question the ethics and the morality of providing certain things to people. But I think the real answer is, okay, you want to stem the demand, and you want to ask the questions around why so many people want and are consuming these things.
Well, I think about someone like Lauryn Hill, who I'm a big fan of, and her, like, a lot of her music and her stuff. I mean, I know that's more like 90s, I guess, at this point, but it's so intelligent, and it's so, like, there's so much beauty in what she's promoting in her words, because she's telling the stories of, some dark things and some, there's definitely like sexual themes, but they're positioned in a way that are putting it in a certain moral order, that you can listen to it and it actually tells the truth about these things, instead of like just dwelling on evil and glamorizing evil, quite frankly. So I think it's also like, you can create a demand for, or there is a demand for depraved things, but there's also a demand for good things and true things and beautiful things. And I think that's obviously why your work is appealing and your voice is appealing, because you're trying to speak the truth. You're doing it in a beautiful way. And so I think it goes both ways, right? There is a demand for evil stuff. Yeah, always has been, always will be. But I do think there's a demand for the good stuff. It just takes a visionary creative to be willing to do the hard work of creating something truly beautiful, as opposed to just doing the degenerate route.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think the reality is, though, that the demand for, fast food is higher than what's the biggest and most profitable restaurant in the world?
McDonald's, is it?
Right? Does McDonald's make
the
best burger?
But it's cheap. It's cheap, right?
It's not even that cheap these days.
It's just,
but
Whole Foods is expensive.
But that's the thing. So there is certainly a demand for. I mean, I wouldn't even be able to have a career.
Yeah.
Neither of us would. Lots of people would not be able to have a career
without McDonald's.
If there was no demand for things that are more positive and encouraging and wholesome and whatnot. But the truth is that the market is smaller.
Yeah.
And we do live in a largely capitalistic and consumer-based society where stuff is about money and making profit. So if you are a record label and you've got, these 5 rappers or singers who are, they're positive, or they're even making faith-based music, or they're talking about, good, positive, wholesome things, and they can sell 200,000 records, and then you've got this is totally debased, and they're just rapping about, drug dealing and having sex with all the women possible and popping champagne and this and that, but that sells 2 million records. The market force is put the focus and, the radio airplay, the Spotify streaming, the television, the music video budgets, all that stuff, more of it goes towards that. And then you end up in this sort of positive feedback loop, I think, where you can also create demand by people being exposed to things. So more and more young people are exposed to that rather than that, and it creates an even greater demand. And this has been going on for many decades at this point. It's not something new. I think now we have social media and smartphones and whatever, so things spread faster and wider. But
you have to train. It's kind of what you're saying. Yeah. You can create more of a demand through exposure, but you can train the market to be more attracted to the good if enough effort is put into it. And I mean, I look at like the history of the 20th century and ideologies that got us to where we are today, and technology to some degree. But I mean, the sexual revolution is something we talk a lot about on Exclusives, and there were architects of the sexual revolution, like very smart but very twisted people like Alfred Kinsey and like, you know, Freud in many ways, who had this very distinct view of the human person. Like, human beings are endlessly sexual and they just want to have sex with anything and anyone. Children are sexual, and their ideas kind of took hold. They got some powerful funders, like the Rockefeller Institute was a big funder of Kinsey. And so, meaning it wasn't an upswell, you know, it wasn't a groundswell, I should say. It wasn't coming from the people saying we want sexual depravity. It was some like architects, ideologues, and financiers who had these crazy ideas, and they pushed those ideas on the population through an organized campaign. And yeah, down the line, now we have degeneracy in a lot of pop culture and media, but it didn't necessarily come because people just were asking for it. Yeah, there were, you know,
forces and ideological people pushing it. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think what's interesting though is throughout history, we always have had these cycles. We've always had these cycles, right? As a religious person, you know that one of the most fundamental understandings of humanity is we are fallen, we are naturally sinful, we're prone to, in the absence of other light and foundations and guiding principles, we are prone to falling back to our basic animalistic natures, right? So even at the time when the Bible or the Torah was, you know, put out there, what's that, 6,000 or so years ago with the Old Testament, then, you know, why were even some of those rules and laws and codes put in? It's because the way people were behaving at that time was not in line with what we now consider, say, Christian principles, right? People were just out there and doing whatever. People were very violent. People were very sexually promiscuous. The value of a life was very cheap. People were killing each other over nothing. You're probably dealing with human sacrifices and all sorts of crazy stuff. And then that comes in and there are principles to correct it. But then all throughout the next several thousand years, you have periods of rebellion. A lot of people talk about Rome and, you know, the fall of Rome, the society. It was very ordered and good and whatever. And then over time, it became very degenerated and debased, and people fell back into those base human natures, and everything changed and ultimately it fell. And so I think it's just cyclical. I think we have cycles, and I think right now we're going through a cycle of debasement and degeneracy over the last few decades. You can again see this coarsening of society in many, many ways. I was not alive in the 1950s or 1940s, but say from then, you know, over the next 80 years or so. And I do think, again, there will be, in morally and culturally, it feels like we are on a decline. You know, we're on a technological incline, but I think more, you know, a lot of people are feeling it. It's a lot of the root of a lot of the culture war stuff and the concerns that people are having about society, about their families, about children, all this kind of stuff. But there's bound to be a correction. You know, the pendulum will swing back. And I just think that's how society goes. And I think we just happen to be caught at this time of all these different intersections and all these different clashes and all these changes going on, where we're in a very weird time, which is confusing a lot of young people, I think, where you have some of these sort of modern or even postmodern ideas, and then they're clashing with traditional ideas and traditional ethics and morals and Christian values, you know.